On the back of this page is really how we try to implement environmental justice, how we try to identify environmental justice impacts on a project basis. So this is kind of the practical way that we approach how we address environmental justice on in our environmental documentation. And the first step that we do is we try to identify whether there are low-income and or minority populations in our project area. Once we have identified minority or low-income populations, then we need to look at how does our project impact those populations. The third step is to determine whether or not these impacts are disproportionately high and adverse. Are they disproportionately borne by the minority and or low-income population? Next, if we do find that there are disproportionate high and adverse effects, we need to seek ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate these effects, and then, of course, implement those measures that we've identified. Throughout this whole process, one of the real key elements is to have involvement with these populations, to ask them, how does this project affect you? Do you think this is going to disproportionately impact you, for instance? Try to get an understanding as to whether these populations feel that they are a community. Only by asking the community and the population themselves are we able to really identify what the impacts will be on that population. And it goes beyond just right-of-way and relocation impacts. It's, are we disrupting this community? Are we having some impacts that we can't foresee? Are there major noise impacts that are being borne by this community? And it's a pretty tough test. We really need to look at, if we find that there are disproportionately high and adverse effects, our first charge is to look at avoiding those effects. Next, we would look at minimizing, and last, we'd look at mitigating them. And on the 41 project, as we mentioned at the last meeting, we did identify major populations of major environmental justice populations, particularly on the E corridors with the mobile home parks there. We do have a population on the C2 alignment, which
it's just off the map. Yeah.
Right, which it's not as big of a population as with the E alternatives, but it is still a population that we need to look at. Can we have further avoidance opportunity of that population? If not, can we look at ways to minimize the impact, and lastly, to mitigate? So when you look at these alternatives as a whole, as we mentioned, the E alternatives, not only are there issues from the FEN perspective, but there were major environmental justice issues with the E alternatives as well.
Just to give you a sense of the magnitude, the percentage for the eastern alignments were in like the 83 to 87% for the E1A and E2. That would be the proportion of low income and minority populations impacted. But even on the C2 with the Jackson Heights manufactured housing park, it looks like it's at about 62%. So there's still a pretty good impact, an environmental justice impact even on the C2.
So hopefully this has clarified that whole issue of environmental justice a little better.